Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, Trade Wars, a conversation on tariffs. The logo for tonight's event that you see up on the screen there was designed with the assistance of artificial intelligence, specifically Microsoft Copilot. Any resemblance to the intellectual property of the Walt Disney Company is entirely coincidental. I'm Nick Seabrook, Professor of Political Science and Director of Public Policy Events here at UNF. This event is part of our Diverse Perspectives series, which promotes open discussion and debate of contested public policy issues from diverse perspectives and facilitates community engagement, intellectual discourse, and the advancement of knowledge, and furthers our core principles of civil discourse and the free exchange of ideas on campus. For our spring Diverse Perspectives calendar, OPPE has been focusing on some of the major public policy issues and questions that are likely to feature prominently in the second Trump administration. Back in February, we did our event on immigration policy, and tonight we are going to be having a conversation on tariffs. So I'd say we're 2 for 2 when it comes to predicting the things that are going to be making the headlines in this administration. So I've been teaching college classes on American government and public policy for almost 2 decades at this point. And for most of that time, tariff policy has been little more than a footnote in the things that I teach in my classes. When we teach students about tax policy, we note that way back in the distant past, the federal government used to raise almost all of its revenues from import duties, from tariffs. But all of that ended with the establishment of the federal income tax in the early 20th century. When we teach students about international trade, we note that economic protectionism was widespread in the 18th and 19th centuries, with nations imposing steep tariffs on imports to shield domestic manufacturers from foreign competition. But that all ended with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, which I'm sure our historian will be talking about in due course, and the eventual establishment of the World Trade Organization, which ushered in the modern era of free trade and globalization. For many decades now, the consensus of economists and policymakers from across the ideological spectrum has been that trade promotes growth, free markets create prosperity, and that the rising tide of the globally interconnected economic juggernaut eventually raises all boats. That consensus, I think it's fair to say, has been significantly challenged over the last 8 years of US history and policymaking. And in the last 8 weeks, it's been entirely upended and turned on its head. Joining me this evening are 2 UNF experts in different disciplines who are here to offer their perspectives on the question of tariffs. Together, the 3 of us represent 3 entirely different academic disciplines: political science, history, and economics, each of which has insights into the debate over tariff policy. At the center of the stage is Dr. Kyle Romero. Dr. Romero is an assistant professor of history and teaches and writes on the history of US foreign policy, immigration and global migration, humanitarianism, and human rights. His first book, Moving People, Refugee Politics and the Emergence of American Humanitarianism, which traces the role of American humanitarians in shaping US refugee politics over the course of the 20th century, is currently under contract with Columbia University Press. Dr. Romero, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
On the right of the stage is, Kyle and I were on the radio this morning, and they were telling us that we had to get as close to the mic as possible when we were speaking. So we're going to have to unlearn that in order to avoid deafening the entire room this evening. On the right of the stage is our third panelist for tonight, Dr. Russell Triplett. He is an associate professor of economics, chair of the Department of Economics and Geography, and interim associate dean for faculty administration and research in the Coggin College of Business. And somehow he was able to make the time with all of those jobs to join us and talk about tariffs this evening. Dr. Triplett teaches courses in international economics, microeconomic theory, and statistics, and his research focuses on international trade, development, and finance, with a special focus on the political economy of US trade policy. So let's begin with a quick introduction on the topic of tariffs before we kind of get into some of the things that have happened not only during the first few months of the Trump administration, but since the beginning of the first Trump administration as well, which has seen some really fundamental changes in the way that we think about economic protectionism, trade, and trade policy here in the United States. I began by mentioning the free trade consensus that has characterized the last half century of US policymaking. While presidents have occasionally made use of targeted tariffs as part of their overall trade policies, think, for instance, of President Obama's 35% tariffs on imports of Chinese tires in 2009, or George W. Bush's tariffs on steel imports in 2002. Temporary, targeted, and limited to achieve specific public policy objectives. But President Trump's first term was characterized by a much more aggressive use of tariffs, both against adversaries like China, but also allies like the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and Japan. And this is where we find out if my clicker is working to advance the slides this evening. There we go. So it wouldn't be a discussion of tariffs and trade policy among three academics if we didn't have a series of charts and graphs to illustrate the various points that we're making this evening. So I do have some visual aids. I will have to explain what is on the slides to my colleagues here. I was thinking that the screens were going to be visible from our vantage points, but it turns out that they are not. And notably, while President Biden did lift or reduce a number of the tariffs that had been put in place during the first Trump administration when he took office in 2021, particularly those on US allies, he notably not only left the tariffs on China in place, but later expanded them, along with additional tariffs in strategic areas such as clean energy and semiconductors. And in fact, the net effect of this, and as is illustrated in the chart that you can see up on the screen, is that the United States actually collected more revenue from tariffs and import duties during President Biden's term than it did during President Trump's first term. Which brings us, of course, to the present day. But before we get into what has happened in tariff policy over the first few months of the Trump administration, I'd like to start by getting some basic background on the topic from our expert panel, from the perspectives of economics and history. And beginning then with Russell, can you give us kind of a brief primer on what exactly tariffs are, how they work, and why economists of all political stripes seem to dislike them fairly intensely?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I holding this at the right distance? Yeah. Okay. So a tariff is a tax. It's a tax on imported products. It's a tax on imported goods. That tax is assessed at the port of entry or at the point of entry, and it is paid by the importer, the domestic business who is responsible for doing the importing. That tax or the tariff can vary a lot by the country of origin. It can vary a lot by the type of good. It can vary a lot by the composition of that good, where the various pieces and parts come from. So when we're discussing the application of tariffs or the increase or decrease of tariffs, the first thing is to remember is that fundamentally a tariff is a tax on imported products. and it is paid by the importer. It's a tax by the importing government on its own economy. I'm not going to pretend to be able to represent the entire field of economics, but I'll make three observations that I think capture the broad sense of how economists view tariffs in mostly a negative light. The first one is that, by and large, tariffs score very low on a cost-benefit analysis. In the case of the US, an economy with, at least as of the beginning of this year, fairly strong macroeconomic indicators, reasonably strong economic growth, relatively low unemployment, falling but somewhat sticky inflation rate, a country that is on the technological frontier and one that is deeply integrated into global markets. I think most economists would agree that a tariff is unlikely to generate a lot of new economic activity, that tariffs are not an especially pro-growth policy. What tariffs do instead in this kind of environment is to shift economic activity, to redistribute value, purchasing power, or income from one part of the economy to another, from one community to another, from consumers to producers, or from downstream businesses to upstream businesses. And so that redistribution, and that redistribution, it comes at a cost, at a significant cost. There are the direct costs that we're all reading about and bracing for in the rise of prices that we are likely to face on a variety of different goods as a result of the new tariffs. And there are indirect costs, what economists will call the deadweight loss or the inefficiency due to tariffs. That inefficiency is largely due to the fact that there is a lot of layers. There's a lot of distance between where the tariff is applied and who it is ultimately intended to benefit. From the importer to the wholesaler, to the distributor, to the retailer, to the ultimate consumer, at each stage, that extra cost, that tax, is either passed along or absorbed or somehow avoided, changing economic behavior and changing business activity all along the way. And to the extent that that reduces economic activity, that reduces production, that eliminates wealth, that's an inefficiency that doesn't show up in the headline prices, but as a cost nevertheless. So I think the first observation I'd make is that economists are very down on tariffs, generally speaking, because of the very unattractive cost-benefit ratio. The second observation I'd offer is that the benefits of tariffs tend to be very concentrated, but the costs of tariffs tend to be very diffuse. And so as a result, it can be difficult to trace out exactly how the economic activity is being shifting and who exactly are the winners and losers from a tariff. The fact that that's a rather opaque policy-making process lends itself to, again, using some terminology here, what economists refer to as rent-seeking behavior. This can include everything from special interest lobbying activity that is perfectly normal, right, in our political environment. This was definitely the case in President Trump's first term. Lots of businesses lined up in Washington appealing for exemptions and waivers from the tariffs that were enacted at that time. That's starting to happen again, we can see. I read somewhere that there's been a 50% increase in the number of registered lobbyists since the beginning of this year. And that rent-seeking behavior can run all the way from what we think of as kind of run-of-the-mill special interest politics all the way to outright corruption. Tariffs are not especially transparent and are very difficult to hold our leaders accountable. That's the second observation. The third is that, again, the third reason why economists are quite down on tariffs in general is that when a country applies tariffs or when a country raises tariffs, it is perceived by its trade partners as a provocative and indeed a hostile act. And those trade partners feel it, compelled to respond in kind. We've all learned the word retaliation, if we didn't already, in trade policy over the past few years. We see that happening already. That retaliation, that trade war that results, is mutually destructive. I think it was the Australian Prime Minister who in recent weeks said, "We can do stupid too." And that kind of sums up how economists view the subject as well. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Russell. I know you said you couldn't speak for your entire profession, but what we have up on the screen there is a survey of 50 economists from across the ideological spectrum that was done back during the 2024 campaign. And pretty much universally, they said that the costs that tariffs impose are almost entirely passed through to consumers rather than being absorbed by importers or through some kind of currency exchange or whatever. And the survey notes that the one economist who disagreed misunderstood the question that was being asked. So turning then to the historical side of this. And the chart that I have up on the screen now basically shows the overall effective tariff rates across US history. And the massive spike to the right of the chart there is the effective tariff rates, assuming that President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs ultimately go into effect. So turning now to Kyle, how were tariffs used historically in the United States? And perhaps more importantly, why do we see this pattern of the line basically going down and down and down? Why did the US move away from tariffs in the 20th century?
Yeah, absolutely. So can everyone hear me okay? I'm very loud in general, so I'm not too concerned about it. So so I'm going to speak in broad strokes here. Because I know you guys don't want me to just inundate you with like dates and names. I will talk about the Smoot-Hawley tariff at some point. I know everyone's super excited for that. But speaking in broad strokes, right? Tariffs were fundamental to early America. The tariff was essentially the kind of only vehicle by which the federal government collected money until 1913. So if you're looking at the 1700s, the 1800s, like early colonial America, pre-antebellum, post-Civil War, the tariff is essentially the fundraising tool that the federal government has. So the tariff was a flashpoint in the Civil War as the industrial North sought to lower the tariff and the agrarian South sought to raise the tariff. That inverted. The industrial North sought to raise the tariff. The agrarian South sought to lower the tariffs for cheaper goods. The tariff was a flashpoint in the late 1800s as the Democratic and Republican parties fought over what they saw as the future of their demographic bases. So I think when you think about the tariff, it is really essential to American politics in the 1800s. So why does that go away, right? Which is your essential question. I think, and again, broad strokes, we can really separate the thinking about tariff policy and free trade into two big eras. This is kind of captured in this chart up here. But until roughly like the 1930s, there was pretty much uniform consensus that tariffs were something the federal government had to do. The question was just how would it be applied, on what industries would it be applied, and for whom would it benefit. Then you have this thing called the Great Depression happen. Notably, before the Great Depression, there's a bill called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raises the tariff. There's debate amongst economists about whether Smoot-Hawley, how much it contributed to the rise of the Great Depression. But what's for sure is that was signed in 1930. The Great Depression worsens over the next 2 years. Pretty uniform consensus that goes down. So in 1934, you have the signing of, as Nick mentioned, the Reciprocal Trades Agreement, which puts the power of negotiating the tariff into the hands of the presidency. It's part of a longer project of Congress largely delegating its power to the executive branch over the 20th century as it sought to kind of insulate itself from political problems. So that worked out pretty well. And so post-1930s, post-World War II, we enter this kind of second era about tariff policy. This is an era where the United States produces, in the 1940s, 1950s, about 50% of the world's goods, which is kind of crazy statistic to think about, right? So about half of everything that was created in the world in the 1940s and early 1950s created in the United States. So the United States now has gone from being a country that wants a high tariff to a country that wants to reduce other countries' tariffs. So what do? The president in the 1930s, FDR, uses his newfound powers to go negotiate lower trade tariffs overseas. And then in the 40s and 50s, the United States is now the predominant global superpower. Early Cold War politics sees reducing tariffs and free trade as a way to cement its kind of geopolitical power and economic power in contrast to the Soviet Union. So big strokes, there's kind of pre-World War II, post-World War II, and the philosophy behind that is rooted in geopolitics, economic policy, and the role of the United States on the world stage.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So it's against this background then, the background of our history when it comes to tariffs and trade policy, the background of what economic theory can tell us about what is a good way to manage these complicated global trade relationships in a way that allows everyone to benefit rather than everyone suffering ill effects, that we have to consider the recent developments in tariff policy that we have seen during the second Trump administration. And it's worth noting that this was something that Donald Trump explicitly campaigned on while he was running for president in 2024. Repeatedly throughout the campaign, but also in his published policy platform, he promised that if he were to be returned to the White House, he intended to impose much more significant and far-reaching tariffs than he had in his first term. And it was precisely those promises that led to the kind of survey of economists during the campaign that I presented on the previous slide. But it's worth noting the differences between what President Trump campaigned on and what we saw announced and implemented and then subsequently paused a couple of weeks ago on quote unquote Liberation Day. President Trump promised a 10% across the board general tariff with a goal of reinvigorating American manufacturing and domestic production. He promised much higher tariffs on imports from China, potentially exceeding 60%. And he promised reciprocal retaliatory tariffs on nations that placed unfair trade barriers in the way of US exports. And with the pause in the initial Liberation Day tariffs, and if you were watching the president's address from the Rose Garden a couple of weeks ago, you would have seen him holding up large printed charts displaying some of the information that you can see on the slide now. A list of countries, a list of the tariffs that they are allegedly charging the United States, and then the reciprocal tariffs that the US is intending to charge them in order to account for that. Incidentally, myself and a group of UNF faculty and students were actually in Washington, D.C. on Liberation Day for entirely unrelated reasons. Every semester, the political science department takes a group of students to Washington, D.C. The students work on a public policy question and present their recommendations to various different government agencies and stakeholders. The question that the students chose this semester was in fact related to China, but it was much more about deterring China with respect to Taiwan and trying to build U.S. alliances around the South China Sea. But at the time that President Trump was conducting his press conference in the Rose Garden, myself and the UNF students were actually in the embassy of the Philippines in a meeting with the Philippines ambassador. While the president was announcing what ended up being 34% tariffs against imports from the Philippines. And you could see the ambassador's aides on their phones becoming increasingly agitated as the press conference went on and kind of whispering to one another as the effects of the president's tariff announcements were being unveiled. But one of the interesting aspects to the Liberation Day tariff announcements is that they arguably went far beyond what President Trump had campaigned on in the 2024 election contest against Kamala Harris. In addition to the 10% across the board tariff, which was in fact put in place, the Trump administration also imposed what it framed as reciprocal tariffs on a wide variety of nations, ostensibly based on the tariffs that those countries were charging the United States, plus the effects of currency manipulation and other trade barriers. But it increasingly became clear as people started to dig into the numbers, particularly the first column that you can see on the chart here, that this was perhaps not how these reciprocal tariffs had been calculated. So turning to our economist for a second, Russell, how were the reciprocal tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on Liberation Day calculated? And is this how you as an economist would have gone about calculating the degree to which these nations are imposing trade barriers on the United States?
That's an easy one. The first question is, I do not know. And the second question is, no, not at all. It appears, based on reporting, that the calculations reflected more of a focus on observed trade balances, bilateral trade balances, and that perceived barriers by other countries were inferred from the size of those balances, and then some tariff rate was determined based on that. But I can neither confirm nor deny that.
And I wanted to follow up a little bit with you as well, based on your first answer today. You kind of talked about the basics of tariff policy, and a lot of the media coverage and discussion of this issue kind of focuses on these top line numbers: 125% tariffs on China, or 24% tariffs on Japan. And as you rightly note, there's a lot of nuance once you start to dig in, and a lot of variance across industries, across products. But there's also something that's called the de minimis exception to import tariffs. And this is something that I think is very important. It's something that's probably under-discussed in this debate. And it's something that President Trump has promised to eliminate, I believe, beginning on May 2nd. So what exactly is the de minimis exemption from tariffs, and what might be the effects of eliminating that, particularly with respect to a lot of the cheap imports that the U.S. receives from China?
Right. To put it simply, the de minimis exemption essentially exempts very low value goods from otherwise applied tariffs. And so you may have heard of some of the low-cost online suppliers, such as Temu and Shine, from which you can order very low-cost items. And provided that comes in, those items come in under a certain value, they are not tariffed at the otherwise legal rate. I think that the most immediate impact of removing that exemption will be, of course, to raise those prices. And it will also cause custom officials a lot of headaches to be able to calculate and assess on every one of those small things that comes in.
But I think a lot of the story behind these products that you see on Amazon, whether it's things like headphones or other electronics, is that what happens, I think, is that you will have some US company, whether it's Apple that's produced a set of headphones, or some other company that has an electronic gadget that it wants to market in the US, and they will often outsource the manufacturing of that product to some producer in China. But what then happens is that the Chinese company now has the blueprints for producing that product. They know the production process for that product. And days later, it seems, there's a company in China that is now manufacturing a clone of that product and selling it on Amazon for a fraction of the price. Is that a pretty accurate description of a lot of the things that fall into this exception?
Sure, I think so.
Okay. And thinking about how tariff rates have been set historically, you talked a little bit, Kyle, in your first answer about how for most of the 19th century, tariff rates were one of the major points of debate between Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and that things shifted in the 1930s to the president having a lot more unilateral authority to set tariff rates. But within the context of those kind of two eras in US history, how have tariff rates been set in the past? What are some of the factors that have gone into this calculus of how much the US should charge in import taxes when we bring in goods from other nations?
Yeah, great question. So, and kind of the answer to that is within the point you just made, right? So remember, our big eras, right? 1930s to the present, before that, right? So the big thing that changes, of course, in the 1930s, the president Congress delegates the power of negotiating tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, to the president. The reason they do that is because the way tariffs were set before the 1930s sometimes was with like the advice of economists, a young and emerging field in the early 1900s of economics, but more often than not was a political project, right? So the way I like to think about it is like the tariff in the late 1800s, early 1900s was kind of like defense spending nowadays. You're never not going to get reelected by raising defense spending, right? But you will not get reelected if you lower defense spending. So there's this kind of arms race, it was a joke, nowadays where both Democrats and Republicans will increasingly raise defense spending because if they don't, they'll get lambasted as being, weak on military interventionism or what have you. The tariff was very much like that in the late 1800s. So both Democrats and Republicans, they would only suffer if they lowered tariffs on goods that hurt their constituents. But they didn't care very much if they hurt the larger economy or hurt constituents in other places. So when the bill would come around every few years to negotiate the tariff, if you're a congressman from Pennsylvania and you have a big steel mill in your town, you're not going to lower the tariff on steel because then that would lower the price of steel for people in your town. People would get laid off. You raise the price on steel. But there's also a congressman in Kansas who has a bunch of pig farmers who live in his constituency. So he's not going to lower the tariff on pigs. There's a congressman in Washington who has a bunch of lumber constituents, right? Not going to lower the tariff on lumber. So essentially this project was a kind of tariff by committee, right? In a way, I think maybe more rational than this system because it was at least based upon constituent pleasing, right? But you have, by the 1930s, after the disasters of Smoot-Hawley, the disasters of the Great Depression, Congress essentially saying like, well, if we just don't do this at all, if we could just delegate this entirely to the presidency, to the executive branch, then we don't have to worry about this anymore. This is the president's fault if tariffs fall down. The same way, right, how in the 1960s to the present, Congress has largely delegated the power to declare war to the presidency. Because if they declare war, like they did in Vietnam, things go badly, they get screwed over by it. But in this case, But in that case, they didn't have to because they've delegated that now to the presidency. So the kind of a long answer to that question, but I think more arbitrary, set by Congress, set by party, and it is only since the Trump administration, I think, that you see these kind of massive tariffs being put in on this kind of personal basis because of that delegation of authority over the past 90 years.
Nick, can I follow up on just that quick question for Kyle? Kyle, given that period of transition you're referring to, how much of that impetus for delegation, it reflects viewing tariffs as a foreign policy tool in a way that it was not in the past?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the Cold War has to be talked about in this too, right? That there was a consensus during the Cold War that a more nimble foreign policy was needed. Often what that means is delegating to the executive branch. I think, we could get into the specifics of it, but I think Roosevelt was this is FDR, the first president to get this power, was very assertive in using the power and kind of centering that in the presidency to try to, consolidate the economic successes of the late 1930s in the beginning of World War II, and then afterwards during the Cold War, I think it became these things are part and parcel of one another. Lowering tariffs abroad was a way to fight the Soviet Union, so it was a thing that the United States executive branch had control over.
And one of the interesting aspects of this, I think, is you mentioned the delegation by Congress to the president. If you read your Constitution, I don't have my copy with me. It's on my desk back in my office. But you'll see that in Article 1 of the Constitution, it gives the power to, this is the taxing and spending clause, it gives the power to impose taxes on imports to the United States to Congress and to Congress alone. And so you may wonder, how is it possible that Congress, who were given this power in the Constitution, have pretty much entirely delegated that power to the president? And we heard part of the story when it comes to what Kyle talked about just now, but it's also the case that not only has Congress given the president huge substantive powers when it comes to regulating all different areas of American society through the creation of various different federal agencies that are under the president's direction. But Congress has also given the president broad emergency powers through various different statutes that have been passed over the years. And these tariffs that President Trump has imposed during his second term, particularly the Liberation Day tariffs, were based on these emergency powers. President Trump declared a national emergency with respect to the trade deficit that the United States has with other nations. The president has largely unchecked powers to declare a national emergency. And that then triggered, under a piece of legislation passed back in the 1970s during the Nixon administration, broad presidential authority when it comes to regulating trade with other nations. And if this sounds a little bit unusual in terms of how we would go about making these types of incredibly significant decisions about international trade, about the way that we govern our economy, we have already seen lawsuits that are challenging the legality of President Trump's actions here, and challenging it specifically under something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which you may have heard come up in some of the recent legal challenges to actions taken by President Biden, specifically student loan cancellation, some of the emergency actions that were taken during COVID with regard to emergency responses to the pandemic as well. And the idea that, and the philosophy that the Supreme Court expressed in those cases and in the Major Questions Doctrine is that there are certain policy decisions that are questions of huge political and economic significance that Congress would not have delegated to the president other than through a clear statutory scheme. And the court argued in the student loans case that, yes, there's a kind of vague, open-ended statute that seems to give the president a lot of power when it comes to student loans in a national emergency. In that instance, President Biden used the national emergency with respect to the COVID pandemic, but we should not read that statute to grant the president those types of broad discretionary powers unless Congress has very clearly indicated that that's what they intended. Similarly, when it comes to the tariffs that President Trump has imposed, you can point to somewhat vague, open-ended language in this 1970 statute that gives the president a lot of authority when it comes to trade policy in a national emergency. But similarly, this is a power that Congress had under the Constitution, and we would expect a pretty clear statutory grant to the president if they had intended to almost entirely and exclusively abrogate that power and delegate it to the president. So we will have to see as those lawsuits play out, and right now they're in their very early stages, exactly how the courts apply the major questions doctrine to President Trump's tariffs, and whether the very same kind of legal tests that thwarted a lot of what President Biden tried to do with student loans and with COVID policy will kind of come back to bite the Trump administration when it comes to a lot of these broad assertions of power and presidential authority that have been made during the first few months of his term. So,
Nick, just a quick comment on that. It's certainly the case that President Trump is, flexing executive power in a number of different areas and really testing the limits and almost inviting court challenges just to see where the line will be drawn. I am not optimistic that the courts will thwart his power over tariffs and trade policy in general, because my sense, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that the trade law is pretty clear in this delegation in a way that other are not. There were some cases brought challenging this authority during the first Trump administration on similar grounds. And at that time, the courts were quite deferential to the president's authority there. I think that insofar as one thinks that this really is an inordinate, exercise of presidential power, it's going to take an act of Congress, literally and figuratively, right, to rein that in.
and it's worth noting that Congress retains the authority to change, alter, cancel, or modify in any way any of these tariff policies at any time if they can assemble not just a majority. Presumably, President Trump would veto any bill that attempted to either reverse his tariffs or claw back some of that authority. But there's nothing preventing kind of a broad bipartisan consensus in Congress, if such a thing is still possible, from taking action. And we've already seen with respect to some of the earlier tariffs that were imposed on Canada and Mexico, at least a majority of the Republican-controlled Senate voting to reverse those policies. Now, that has not come for a vote in the House, because the House, this is an interesting aside, but the House essentially voted to modify the linear nature of time in order to short circuit a provision that would have required a vote within a certain number of days when requested by a member of the House on the cancellation of these tariff policies. They effectively voted to treat the entirety of the remainder of this session of Congress as a single day in time, solely for the goal of preventing this question from even ever coming up for a vote. Now, they have not yet done that, as far as I know, for the Liberation Day tariffs, but nothing is preventing them from messing with the nature of time itself in order to continue to delegate and short circuit any attempt to try and have a vote to overturn these policies. And maybe now we can turn to what exactly are the philosophical underpinnings of both tariffs more generally, but also these specific tariffs, because a major point of contention in the debates since President Trump took office back in January, and partly confusion that has been created by his own administration and some of the contradictory explanations that have been given for these tariffs, is just what exactly are we trying to achieve through these policies? Is this just a negotiating tactic to bring other nations to the table, to create leverage and encourage them to agree to trade deals that have favorable terms for the United States? President Trump himself has made certain statements to suggest that this may be a negotiating tactic. Is this a way for the federal government to raise revenue, to help reduce the deficit, to help pay down the national debt, and perhaps eventually to replace the federal income tax? This was a component of Project 2025, something that President Trump distanced himself from during the campaign, but which bears a more than passing resemblance to a number of the policies that he has implemented since taking office. Or is this about protectionism? Is this a tactic to encourage the reshoring of jobs, a revitalization of American manufacturing, an investment in domestic production? And the philosophy behind these tariffs makes a big difference, because these goals are mutually inconsistent with one another. And perhaps the hardest thing to nail down in this entire tariff debate is whether the Trump administration is pursuing these tariffs because they genuinely think that they are good policy that will be of the ultimate benefit to the United States, or because they think this is a way to gain leverage over other nations and get new and better trade deals that ultimately will lead to tariffs no longer being necessary. So I'll ask Kyle about this question initially. Thinking about the philosophy behind tariffs, how has the philosophy behind U.S. trade policy and tariffs evolved over the decades? What are some of the historical events that have significantly kind of shaped this evolution? And what might that tell us about the situation that we find ourselves in now?
Yeah, all right, I'm going to answer it all really quick. No, no, I think it's a great question. So I think when I think of flashpoints around tariff policy, we can, we don't need to talk about like the 1800s anymore. We can get slightly closer to the present. I think a lot about the post-World War II period, right? So tariffs are reduced, free trade becomes the kind of consensus philosophy amongst the center-left and the center-right in the United States, what's often called like the neoliberal consensus in the late 20th century, this general unifying belief amongst politicians, economists, sociologists, policymakers, et cetera, is that free trade is good. Like you said at the beginning, Nick, this philosophy that free trade lifts all boats, free trade is good for everyone, it is always beneficial. I think I see a few flashpoints in the past 50 years that I think can maybe help elucidate some of what's going on today. I think a big turn is the 1990s, right? So after the signing of NAFTA in 1992, there is a strong backlash, especially amongst the left in the United States, against a belief that globalization, free trade, is unequal, that it explicitly has allowed the powerful countries, most of those in the global north, the United States, Europe, to exploit the global south, places in Africa, East Asia, et cetera. And so that there was a belief, especially amongst the left, that free trade was kind of an engineered product of the right that has come to dominate American foreign policy. This is kind of folded in, I think, with the in military interventionism of the 1980s and 1990s that the United States pursued overseas. And so I think that's a big flashpoint. And I think this culminates with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I think there's no better it's always so hard as a historian to draw like strict times when an era ends, right? When one period ends and another begins. But I think 2016, you see the rise of two very much polar opposite figures, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, both of whom believed that free trade was a fundamental problem for the United States, that it had made the poor poorer and the rich richer. I think of course, Bernie Sanders would go on to lose the Democratic primary. Hillary Clinton would win the primary, and then Donald Trump would win the election in 2016. I think getting to Trump specifically, as you mentioned, Nick, it's very hard to nail down his exact politics and ideology on a myriad of issues, right? On a range of issues, because he seems open to saying one thing one day and one thing the other day, depending on his mood, his feelings, the last person who talked to him, whatever was on Fox and Friends that morning. So I think to get at the issue of trade and his philosophy on trade, I think is maybe a fool's errand, because I'm not sure there is a philosophy there. I think if you go back through Trump's personal history, he has long talked about trade deficits as a huge problem, which I think is notable. Even in the 1970s and 80s, when he was a real estate developer in New York, he would harp in the pages of the New York Times, the New York Post, about trade deficits, particularly with Japan. It's difficult to know. I read some of those before coming here, whether he actually understands what a trade deficit is. I think he believes that a trade deficit is meaning that their country is like taking money from us, when actually, of course, a trade deficit is the difference in the amount of goods that you trade. So Japan was selling more goods to the United States was selling to Japan. That's a trade deficit. So I think for Trump, the kind of tariffs as a policy are useful because they are unilaterally controlled by the executive branch. They do not need oversight from Congress. They will largely be resistant to a court ruling, as you mentioned, Russ. And so tariffs are a nice tool for the president to use because they are largely restricted from oversight. And I think for Trump, part of his kind of appeal to in his election and then his re-election last year is a kind of nostalgia for a mythologized past. This is, of course, the campaign slogan of the Trump campaign, right? Make America great again. That's an explicitly historical claim, right? America was great at one point and it is not anymore, according to Donald Trump. So I think tariffs as a policy are a way to, his mind, the mind of his supporters, recapture some past, a past when America was a great industrial nation, and in the minds, I think, of some of his supporters, especially people on the far right, like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, to recapture a gender politics and a racial politics from a time that they believed when the world was better. Josh Hawley made this explicit in his book that just came out last year, where he said that America was great when men could go work in a factory and women stayed at home. So I think for the Trump administration, tariffs as a policy are useful because of their ability to be restricted from oversight, and their philosophy is more girded in this kind of nostalgic reminiscing for an era that never really quite existed, but is a kind of mishmash of historical examples that they find entrancing.
Nick, if I can piggyback on that, I think Kyle answered that really well, and I would just add, and again, at the risk of kind of doing a psychological analysis of the president, which is always risky. If you think about tariffs and the power of tariffs, and I think Kyle alluded to this, in the first administration, the first Trump administration, he was stymied a lot and struggled a lot in dealing with Congress. Right? And so here is a policy tool that does not require that he negotiate with anybody on the Hill, right? And it's just sitting there waiting to be used. And at the same time, the Trump administration does not have a lot of what you political scientists would call soft power, right? They don't have a lot of foreign governments, aiming to be like them. A few maybe, but here, follow my example. Here, we'll lead the way. And yet, and the tariff as a foreign policy tool becomes a very convenient substitute for soft power as well, internationally. So when dealing with both of these kind of environments, the domestic political environment, he doesn't really like dealing with Congress and members of Congress, or he thinks they're beneath him, but he doesn't need that to use a tariff. He doesn't really like most foreign leaders. He thinks they're beneath him, and he doesn't really have to get them to go along with the tariff. But it's also, I would say, to give him credit, a very masterful approach to coalitional politics. Because the Republican Party and Trump supporters are a coalition, right, a political coalition of varying groups with varying interests or priorities, some of whom, as Kyle was suggesting, have a vision for industrial policy, make America great again, we're going to rebuild the factories, we're going to, get the heartland back, etc. And so selling tariffs with that vision makes a lot of sense to them. But other parts of the Republican or Trump coalition are very fixated on deficits and debt and the financials, the books, as it were, of the federal government. And so selling tariffs to them as a way to raise revenue and maybe alter, tax policy, well, that's really popular there. And still other members of the, Republican Trump coalition are more traditional, what we might think business interests or business elites. And so if you argue to them, hey, look, this is just the opening salvo, we're really aiming to lower barriers to our exports. At the end of the day, we're going to have more open trade across the board. Well, then that's a way to sell that to them too. Mm-hmm. So I do think that in some sense, intentional or not, he's landed on a policy tool over which he has broad discretion, does not need a lot of assistance, and which he can sell to the variety of these groups that underpin his coalition and keep him popular. Mm-hmm. You're right, though. They are mutually contradictory. Yeah. And at some point, that will come to a head.
Does anyone want to offer a guess at who the two dapper gentlemen on the slide here are? Yes, that is correct. They are Senator Reed Smoot on the right and Representative Willis C. Hawley on the left. Any relation to Josh Hawley?
I don't think so, but that'd be an interesting little tidbit, huh?
Well, we'll look into that.
He's the son of a banker, so I don't know, maybe it's connected, yeah.
So I want to make sure we reserve time for audience questions, but just to kind of finish off and round out our discussion here, we've spent a lot of time talking about tariffs generally, across the board tariffs, the philosophy behind tariffs, but what we've seen since Liberation Day a couple of weeks ago is a major divergence in the way that the Trump administration has approached most of the countries in the world with respect to tariffs and the way that it has approached China. Similarly, we've seen a pretty significant divergence between the way that other countries are reacting to President Trump's tariff policies compared to how China is reacting. So while the president left 10% across the board tariffs in place, despite his pause on the reciprocal tariffs that we saw on the previous slide, he further raised tariffs on imports from China to initially 125% and then subsequently 134%. China has retaliated with its own tariffs on American exports and has also announced that it's going to be imposing export controls on various rare earth minerals, which are crucial for manufacturing various consumer and military technologies. So regardless of what happens with these kind of broader negotiations, whether this is about raising revenue ultimately, whether this is about negotiating better trade deals with our allies and these other nations, it seems that we are now in the middle of an escalating trade war with China, one which the slide illustrates goes far beyond the kind of trade war that we saw during the first Trump administration. You can see that the tariffs that the US and China both imposed on each other did increase modestly between 2017 and 2020, but in the last couple of months, those lines kind of just go off the charts, and we've seen rapidly and massively escalating reciprocal tariffs, both the US imposing on China and China imposing on the US. And So I want to ask our two panelists to close out our discussion here before we get to questions. What is the likely effect of this kind of massive trade war between the two wealthiest nations and largest economies in the world? Can we learn anything from historical trade wars here, or is this something that is entirely unprecedented, that we've never really seen before? Two nations this economically powerful going toe-to-toe against one another with escalating reciprocal tariffs.
I'll take a stab. I think comparisons and analogies are always tough with history. I don't want to just say, oh, well, this is exactly like the 1861 or what have you, But I do think kind of core to the philosophy of free trade, espoused by people ranging from like Friedrich Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society to left-wing activists in the early 20th century, is the idea that a more restricted world is a more dangerous world. That a world with high trade barriers, with lack of communication, with lack of connection, is always going to be one that's more prone to acts of immense violence. So I think it's tough to say if that vision will be realized in the modern world. I do know is that this is a strict departure from American policy for the past 75 years. And American policy for the past 75 years has not exactly been peaceful, to say the least. So I think the kind of warnings about that this is like might lead to an impending war, I'm not saying if they're true or untrue, but I think that might be kind of unrelated. I think that's one observation. I think my other observation is something that's been central to not only the American economics, but also American culture and politics for the past 75 years has been cheap access to consumer goods. I think nothing defines America and Americanism more than consumption and consumer goods throughout basically post World War II to the present day. I think that era might be ending. And so we'll see politically what the effects of that will be, of cheap consumer goods going up in prices. Evidence would suggest that would not be very good for the current political administration. But of course, President Trump has defied political gravity many times in his career. So I think if we're thinking of eras, I think that era might be at an end. And we can only kind of look to, political scientists and economists for what the future will look like in that case.
Yeah, I'll add another vulnerability here. I mean, I agree with you. I think that we could be headed into an era, and I use that word advisedly, right, of a relatively higher cost of living across the board, which would not be pleasant for anyone, I don't think. But I would also point out that quite a lot of imports to the U.S., especially imports from China, are not direct to consumers, but are instead intermediate inputs, right, into business processes, manufacturing activity that takes place here. So we learned during COVID about the supply chains and how sensitive those were to disruption and what that disruption can mean as it flows through the various stages. And I think what we're getting ready to see and perhaps have to relearn is the vulnerability and the shock that will provide, yes, on the consumer end, but also on the business end. There are a lot of companies right now that are scrambling to find alternative sources for inputs, for raw materials, for parts. Some will be able to do so, some will not. And that will cause real economic harm and real economic pain as well. I'll just add this too. China's not in great shape, right? They have their own economic problems. They had a very hard several years due to their COVID lockdowns. They're dealing with an investment and financial crisis of their own, having to do with over investment in real estate. They do not yet have the developed consumer economy that they would need to be more resilient to this kind of a trade war. And so they too are taking significant risks by escalation. This is not a one-sided kind of downward spiral. It is definitely mutually destructive.
So just to quickly kind of sum up from my political science perspective, and I think what we've seen, we saw this in the first Trump administration, and we've seen it to some extent, at least, in President Trump's second term, that he is in a meaningful way constrained by his own party in Congress, constrained by public opinion to an extent, and I think in particular constrained by the reaction to some of his policies on Wall Street. There was kind of a notion in his first term that his policies would kind of directly be determined by whether the stock market was going up or down on a given day. That's perhaps been less true in his second term, but at the very least, it does seem like some of the developments in the bond market after Liberation Day gave significant caution to him kind of plowing full speed ahead with these tariffs. And we saw from, Russell mentioned the supply chain snafus coming out of COVID. We saw during the Biden administration how little tolerance the American people have for inflation, how little tolerance they have when grocery prices are going up, when the prices of the other essentials that they have to buy day to day, week to week, are going up. And we're starting to see in public opinion surveys, not only President Trump's approval rating starting to tick down, but to tick down particularly when it comes to his handling of the economy. And this was his greatest strength during his first term, and a big part of the reason why he beat Kamala Harris back in November of last year, because voters, we talked about nostalgia, they had nostalgia for the pre-COVID economy of the first Trump term, and they thought they were voting for a repeat performance of that. And if that is not what is delivered to them, we may see some very, very meaningful decline in public opinion. And there is an election coming up, a midterm, in not all that long. And a substantial number of these Republicans in Congress, every member of the House and a third of the members of the Senate are going to have to face the voters in 2026. So one thing to watch out for is exactly how public opinion plays out and the extent to which the administration and certainly the extent to which Republicans in Congress may be watching polls like this one, which suggest that the American people overwhelmingly and on a bipartisan basis think that tariffs have the effect of increasing prices. And if that is ultimately what manifests, President Trump may find himself getting blamed for that in much the same way that President Biden was for the inflation that we experienced coming out of COVID. I want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions at this point. So if you would like to address a question to the panel, do please feel free to come up to the microphone in the center here. In the meantime, I want to thank my two colleagues for giving up their time today and for sharing their insights on this important public policy area. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a million questions, but I do want to say it was really an excellent education thing. Back in the late 1900s and stuff, there was a fair tax movement where they said essentially a 20 or 25% sales tax to replace income tax, and they said this is more fair. It occurred to me, is this a national sales tax that will replace income tax? Is this a way of, is this a fair tax policy or whatever?
So I'll answer that this way. An import tariff is not the same as, say, a national sales tax insofar as it would only be applied to imported goods. And so it would by no means raise the kind of revenue that a national sales tax on all items would perhaps accomplish. There is, I think, some desire from the administration and from us as allies in Congress to try to substitute revenue coming from tariffs and maybe other sources for income taxes, because the president's tax cut bill, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, I think, from his first administration comes due this year. And he has made it very clear as part of the campaign and certainly in many speeches since that he would like to see that not only renewed, those tax cuts renewed, but perhaps even expanded and extended. Those tax cuts on income, especially high income earners, and the corporate tax cuts, the benefits from those cuts will skew towards the upper end of the income spectrum. And the burdens of a larger tariff, right, of more revenue being generated through a tariff is going to be disproportionately shouldered by lower and middle class families. I think that's actually pretty standard Republican policy platform. That's not so unusual, and it does seem like we are headed in that direction.
Okay, can I ask you all to look into the future? What if nothing changes from the policy now? What do you predict is going to happen 6 months down the road? And if we do back off, can you put the toothpaste back in the tube? Can we undo the negative feelings about U.S. or the damage that's been done? Do you think, what do you think about that?
Try that one.
Well, so let's assume then that the pause on the kind of large reciprocal tariffs, that pause stays in place. And so what we're looking at is ultimately something pretty similar to what President Trump campaigned on: 10% across the board tariffs on all imports, combined with aggressive tariffs against China. I think, and there are, Russell's talked about how the consensus of economists is generally against tariffs, but there are certainly economists who think that that kind of approach, so not the large and arguably fake reciprocal tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day, but something similar to what we would see if things stayed exactly the same as they are now. And I'm thinking of the work of economists like Oren Cass, for instance, who's at American Compass. This is a conservative think tank, and who has written extensively in defense of these tariff policies. And so if you're interested in kind of the steelman case for how this could all work out to the benefit of the United States, I would encourage you to read some of his work. But the idea would be that if things work out, we would see a reorientation of the American economy in a way that does boost domestic production, in a way that, and by design, this would mean a short-term and perhaps quite significant increase in prices. It might even mean a recession, but coming out the other side of that, the goal, if you want to try and put a philosophy behind what's going on now, and I don't necessarily think that the president himself has one, but there are a lot of smart people working in the Trump administration who support this policy and have a goal in mind for what they're trying to achieve. I'm somewhat skeptical. I think a lot of economists are somewhat skeptical that will be the actual effect of these policies, but that's kind of the steelman case. Mm-hmm. I can't help but conclude that we are likely to see potentially a recession within the next year, but certainly some fairly significant increases in the prices of things like groceries, the prices of the things that we buy on Amazon, and affect things to that effect. The long-term effects, I think, are much less clear.
Yeah. Good evening. I've worked in factories all my life. I've been an expat for 3 years in China. I know all about that place. So my question here is, it appears that the president is rolling back, or Congress wants to cut some of the infrastructure spending that's out there, some of the taxes, some of the funding for the CHIPS Act and other things. As a manufacturing person, I would always build my factories where it's the cheapest to build the factories. Can you explain to me how the president's going to address the areas that need employment in the manufacturing areas, because they're going to be very expensive to refurbish based on gray field or brownfield issues and things like that? I don't understand how he's going to help his people in these areas when it's all said and done with these tariffs.
I have a historical example. I think it's a good point. I think the point you made earlier, sir, about putting the toothpaste back in the tube, I think is an accurate analogy here. That reindustrializing the Rust Belt is maybe the stated goal of these tariffs, but I'm highly skeptical that would be the case. The example that I was thinking of in response to your question, which is a historical case study where high tariffs actually did help to industrialize specific regions. This is in the case of South Korea after the Korean War. So in the 1960s and 70s, the Park dictatorship in South Korea put extremely high tariffs on very specific sectors, automaking, steel infrastructure production. As we are well aware, I drive a Hyundai Elantra, so those sectors have been highly successful in the South Korean economy and have become kind of cornerstones of South Korea's major expansion throughout the 20th century and its successes in the past 20, 30 years. However, I think the difference here is that those tariffs were paired with heavy spending by the government to incentivize production in certain places. So I think if these tariffs were paired with, massive federal grants for companies to rebuild, factories in Ohio to Pennsylvania to Indiana, what have you, to the kind of places that Trump campaigned on bringing back those factories, I think that's a possibility. That's not been proposed. That's not been.
Just wait.
Yeah.
The subsidies are coming.
Okay.
I have no doubt. I think that the disruptions, sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
I think that the disruptions that we are going to see due to the tariffs are going to create a lot of pain, that will reach Washington, that will reach the White House, and the president will be tempted and will push his allies in Congress to essentially do a lot of bailout-like subsidies, all with the goal of trying to reach, his end policy goals that the tariffs began with, the stated goals. We saw in the first Trump administration that one of the biggest harms or one of the biggest costs of the retaliation by China at that time was to agricultural interests, right? And very quickly, the Trump administration at that time came out with a huge bailout for farmers as a way to try to dampen that pain. I would not be surprised at all if we see not an especially rational, but a series of tax breaks, subsidy programs as a way to try to ameliorate the self-imposed pain. Yeah.
And I think that whatever your feelings may be about the underlying wisdom of tariffs as a policy, the real killer that is, even if the tariffs are going to work, that is undermining that kind of investment is the chaos and uncertainty that we've been going through. And I think if I were advising the Trump administration, I would tell them just pick a lane, decide on a tariff policy, commit to it. And let's not have all of this going back and forth, imposing tariffs and then pausing them and then imposing them again. Because if you're someone who's thinking about building a factory and you're trying to decide whether you're going to locate it in Mexico or South Carolina, and you have no idea 6 months from now, a year from now, if the tariffs on imports from Mexico are going to be 0, are going to be 10%, are going to be 25%, that prevents you from making the decision as to where to locate that factory. And instead of either located in Mexico because it's going to be cheaper to import the vehicles from there or whatever it is you're making, or located in the United States because tariffs make it more economically competitive for you to do so. In the situation we find ourselves in now, what you are instead going to do is you're going to do nothing. You're not going to make that decision. You're not going to make that investment. And that ultimately, I think, is what is going to undermine the ability of the administration to achieve its own goals through this policy. So President Trump, if you're listening, pick a lane and stick with it. Enough of this back and forth and uncertainty.
Hi. So you mentioned in 2016 how it was not just from the right, or it wasn't just a Trump policy against free trade. You know, it was also a Bernie Sanders, a left policy, the more left wing of the Democratic Party. And that was, I remember at the time, that was very specifically about the negotiations ongoing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Essentially a NAFTA for the Pacific, in kind of a reductionist terms, but still. And one of the first things Trump did upon entering office was pull the United States out of those negotiations. It's important to note that the Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't die there. It was reorganized into the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is still a very large trading bloc in the region, now kind of led by Japan as the largest economy in it. And that just recently in 2021, China applied to join the CPTPP. Whatever it's called. Love their acronyms. Does something like this, that kind of like really shakes confidence in the United States as a trading partner and shows that the United States is no longer really interested in multilateral trade agreements and would rather negotiate one-on-one if we want to negotiate at all, which is still up in the air, that perhaps China could become this kind of could fill that role as someone who is as a large economy that wants to engage, that is willing to engage with these multilateral agreements, and perhaps is the more agreeable trading partner. Whereas in the past they had been seen more of as something of a trade pariah. Now they might be the preferable partner to the United States. And does this create a vacuum that China is all more than eager to fill?
There does seem to be some momentum behind the idea of, instead of a global or multilateral trading system, of there being instead there's our questioner. Okay, an evolution into something of more of a regional-based trading blocks. One encompassing North and South, Western Hemisphere, North and South America, perhaps led by the U.S. One representing Europe and surrounding countries, and then one in the Asia-Pacific region led by China, perhaps. I think that there were efforts in the past by U.S. administrations to try to resist that fracturing. But I do think you're right that one of the natural reactions to the costs and the disruptions that really this very highly escalated trade war may have is to incentivize countries to start looking for new partners, to start looking for new natural allies. And when you're uncertain and when you're unsure, your neighbors, right, your neighboring countries who you probably trade the most with anyway, are a natural find.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Great question. I think a historical example of this would be, you had Smoot and Hawley up there, right? In the kind of post-Smoot Hawley tariff era. I think the big problem, like I mentioned earlier, right? There's debate about whether Smoot-Hawley actually caused the depression, worsened it, et cetera. But I don't think there's much debate about what the effects of Smoot-Hawley had, which were the United States raised its tariffs. Everyone else raised their tariffs as well in reciprocal tariffs. So I think mutual trust is kind of at the core of global trade. Mutual reliance is at the core of global trade. So the United States maybe divesting itself of its role as kind of the preeminent leader of global trade is going to have knock-on effects throughout the world. I'm skeptical in the case of China kind of taking the role, especially in East Asia. I think there was a couple years ago, 2022 or 2023, in the Biden presidency, President Biden went on a tour of Southeast Asia to try to shore up kind of alliances in the wake of Chinese aggression especially in Hong Kong. And notably, the three countries that Biden went to were the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. Does anybody know what those three countries have in common? They were all invaded by the United States, and they all hate China, right? So they have two things in common. They're former enemies of the United States, and they all hate China more than they hate the United States. So I think there's something to be said for like strange bedfellows in the wake of this divestment. But I do think that there are kind of longer antipathies in East Asia that are going to be pretty central to that trade negotiations.
Earlier, Russell, you had mentioned that China is not in the best state currently, but expanding upon that, I wanted to get your opinion on whether or not you think them raising tariffs on the U.S. at such an extreme level is them trying to call the U.S.'s bluff, so to speak, thinking that perhaps advisors and economists in China believe the U.S. Doesn't actually intend to commit to or take seriously the idea of, enlarged and increased tariffs on China or anywhere else in the world, and are, increasing their own tariffs against the U.S. As a way to quickly force the U.S. to, back out of the proposition and get back to some other state.
I think you're probably right. I do think that was a very strategic kind of move, motivated more by trying to establish a bargaining position, a negotiating position for going forward, rather than a strictly economic move. I think that the magnitude of those moves signifies how serious this has become. But I think you're quite right.
When we were on our UNF trip to DC back at the beginning of this month, one of the places that we visited was the Chinese embassy in Washington, DC. And so, as I said earlier, the students had worked on this policy paper with respect to what approach the U.S. should take in international relations when it comes to China and other Southeast Asian countries. And we had sent the Chinese embassy a copy of this paper ahead of time. And when we got to the embassy, they had assembled an entire panel of Chinese experts to do a point-by-point rebuttal of everything the students had written in their paper about China policy. This was the day before Liberation Day, so we did not get to see their reactions to the tariffs in real time. But what concerned me most in that meeting was what they said about Taiwan and the attitude towards Taiwan that is still widespread and endemic in Chinese politics, that Taiwan is a part of China, that the Taiwanese are their brothers. And this was the language they used. They described them as their brothers who they have been temporarily separated from. But however long it takes, whether it's 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, they will eventually be reunited with. And so I worry that all of the disruption and all of the chaos that is caused by this escalating trade war may ultimately embolden China or perhaps back China into a corner where they end up taking some kind of rash action with respect to Taiwan. And the repercussions of that for the United States and for the global economy, given the centrality of Taiwan when it comes to chip manufacturing, could be incredibly devastating. So that's what worries me. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but it's a major point of concern, I think.
I just want to start by saying thank you for the great talk and thank you for making it open to the public. And I heard you guys mention that the timing of the pause on the Liberation Day tariffs coincided with that spike in the bond market. So I was wondering, like, why did we see that spike in the bond market in regards to the tariffs that were imposed, and then why that matters? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of volatility in the equities market, the stock market, ever since Trump, turned his attention towards tariff and started announcing, lots of different tariffs, but especially on the Liberation Day. But volatility in the stock market, although it was severe, right, is nothing new, and is something that I think leaders can tolerate at least for a while, right? They know that there's going to be some bounce back. They know that there's going to be some correction. But when the equities market and the bond market and the dollar all started falling at the same time, that is what got people's attention, all the way to the White House, right? That is when the Secretary of the Treasury called the president and said, okay, we got to do something about this, right? Normally, economic theory would tell us that all else equal, raising tariffs would tend to lead to an appreciation of the currency as an adjustment mechanism, right? As a price adjustment mechanism. And the fact that instead in the currency markets, dollars were being sold and dollar-denominated treasury bonds were being sold suggested a loss of confidence in the U.S. economy going forward. And that's devastating. The bond market has tamed many presidents and prime ministers of lots of different stripes. And I think this president got his first lesson in that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Hi, how you doing?
More of a political history question. During the Independence or Liberation Day, there was a lot of representatives of unions there, and historically unions have always been democratic, or at least when they support. I remember doing a report on Sherrod Brown, who was the Democratic senator from Ohio, and a long time he was been an opponent of NAFTA, mainly because of job loss in the Midwest. I just wanted to know, what are the greater implications for not only Trump's coalition and the Republican Party, but also the Democratic coalition, who lost this American worker?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. So I think there's kind of multiple stories going on here, right? So deindustrialization in the United States really kind of begins to rapidly accelerate in the 1970s and 80s. So you have the kind of moving out of massive industries, most of whom were stocked by union labor throughout the kind of mid 20th century. So that's happening, right? In that same context, the U.S. is championing free trade. So I think by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, these systems are kind of working together. So as we mentioned before, right? Bernie Sanders, the far left wing of the Democratic Party, not even a member of the Democratic Party, famously, right? His critique is that NAFTA kind of not only accelerated industrialization, it moved out those jobs, and it hurt working people in ways that were maybe unintentional, but were definitely the consequence of NAFTA. I think to some extent that is true, and even supporters of globalization will say that deindustrialization was a byproduct of globalization. Moving industrial production to the global South made it way cheaper, made Americans more advanced in other sectors. So I think there is that left-wing critique. Unions, people like the former senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, union activists had long been critical of NAFTA from the left. I do think it's notable that there is now this kind of rightward critique of NAFTA, led by Donald Trump in this case. So I think that's one story. I think the other story is that just the decline of unions since that period too, right? So you have some union support for Donald Trump, but I think, you know, the unions in 2025 are not the unions of the 1970s. They're not the political powerhouse that they were. And we saw a lot of vacillation in a lot of the biggest unions, the UAW, the SEIU, over whether or not to support Trump, because largely they had seen a lot of their political power evaporate over the past 30 years. So I think, you know, you even had this strange thing last year of like every individual chapter of the UAW kind of endorsing individual people, but the UAW as a whole kind of putting its hands up and saying, well, we don't want to get involved in this, right? So I think there's been a kind of divestment of political will and political power amongst unions in the past 50 years. And so you see individual chapters kind of embracing Trump under the idea that by eliminating the elements of globalization, it will revitalize unions.
I do think the phenomenon that you identify there is one of the things that has been and will continue to undermine the ability of the Democratic Party to put up a united front in opposition to President Trump's tariff policies. It's also a big part of the explanation of, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that when President Biden took office, he largely left the tariffs that President Trump had put in place during his first term in place, and even expanded some of them as well. So the fact that organized labor on the left is to some extent supportive of tariffs, they may quibble with the way that President Trump has gone about pursuing policy here, but we've seen it in some of the kind of the lukewarm statements that have come out from many prominent Democrats in opposition to this. It's been along the lines of, well, tariffs aren't always bad, but let me tell you, the way this guy's going about doing it, that this is all wrong and we should do it a different way. It's really the disappearance of this kind of centrist consensus that believed in globalization, that believed in free trade, made up of the center left and the center right. And the center has been disappearing in American politics for some time now. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that.
Nick, how much of that is related? How much of that is driven by Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, now becoming regular, gotta have states if you're going to win the White House, in a way that even a generation ago, they were kind of solid blue, always blue. You could almost take them for granted if you were a Democrat. And if you were a Republican, you didn't have much of a shot.
No, I definitely think that's been part of it. And as Democrats have become less competitive in places like Florida, the kind of swing states of 15, 20 years ago, as Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin have become central in presidential elections, I think that has very real effects when it comes to distorting federal policy. And there's political science research that shows that swing states in presidential elections get a favorable treatment when it comes to federal policy, whether it's money flowing or various other things as well. That's a real concern.
Sure. Hi, sorry, I don't know how much I have to lean in. I want to say it is kind of relieving to see so many like younger people wanting to ask you guys questions. I've noticed over the last 15-ish years, the young population and the college-age population has been steadily declining, and there's statistics on this. So one of the things that I've been trying to do more so on campus is advocate for young people to vote, but it seems, at least in part, kind of a mute goal or a mute effort to do so. I hear a lot of these leftist or liberal sentiments about, oh, well, until the Democratic Party caters to my needs or what I want, I'm just not going to give them what they want. And in turn, I'm going to retaliate and try to make a statement to them about this. But it doesn't seem to be making a statement at all about it. And I don't know what kind of thing will convince them to vote and convince them that democracy is important and that their voice in democracy does actually work. I mean, we saw Gabe Alamont and Josh Weil just lose the two elections in District 1 and District 6, and that was widely disappointing because although there was so much raised in comparison to their opponents, they still lost those districts. Not quite as badly as they have in the past, but they still lost those districts. And so I've seen Florida kind of move across the Overton window more to the right. And it seems like a lot of these policies are similar to the Reagan administration, as far as cutting burdens on the wealthy and distributing these flat taxes that are primarily hurting your average middle class or lower class person. And it seems like the face of the right-wing movement to be able to push this agenda is appealing to farmers and appealing to the hardworking American dream and promoting that type of social mobility that actually isn't, seeing played out in the real world. But I guess my question is how do you think, because you mentioned something about you think that there might be a possibility that the Democrats coming up in the future elections will be kind of scared enough to really push harder in those elections as far as trying to get people on board. But how do you think that you convince these young voters who have such a defeatist mind state? Like, is it populism? Is it like just appealing to that the farmers and the middle class? Or, I mean, why do you think that like the left has such a defeatist mindset about these things?
Well, I wish I had a good answer for you. I'm afraid this is a question that we've kind of been confronting for decades at this point. And every election, it seems like we hear that, okay, this is finally going to be the one in which the youth vote is mobilized and they turn out in large numbers. And every election, it fails to happen. So I'm afraid, I think if there were an easy way to do this, we would have stumbled upon it already in the numerous election cycles where we've been attempting to do it. Ultimately, what do I think it'll take to fully mobilize the youth vote? Maybe if the federal government reimposes the draft, like it did during Vietnam, I think that would probably do it. Short of that, I think there are small-scale things that we can do in our local communities, on our individual campuses, to reach out, to talk to young voters, to hear their concerns. I don't think we're going to see a large-scale mobilization, but I think at the individual level, there is the possibility to get people more engaged. And so that's what I would encourage you to focus on. Ignore the big picture and concentrate on the difference that you can make here at UNF and here in the local community.
Yeah, I would just add too, I think we live in a cynical time. I think we can all agree, right? I interact with 18 to 22-year-olds every single day. Y'all are great. I think you're doing a great job. But of course, you who are people who are here are uncommon in the country, right? People who are deeply engaged in politics enough to spend your Tuesday evening to come listen to, three people gab about history and economics and politics and stuff like that. That is not the common experience of people. Just the same way that like the average college student is not representative of every 18 to 22-year-old, right? So I think combating cynicism is the hardest thing to do in the world. I struggle with it. I'm deeply cynical and nihilistic about most things because I'm a millennial, right? It's like, this is my lot in life, right? I think Nick's point about kind of embracing local action is absolutely correct. I think also, like, this is what politics is, right? There's been social science research on what's called like issue relevancy, like when an issue becomes relevant to people. And I've been, there are studies that basically say issues become relevant to people when like politicians and policymakers make them relevant to people. A good politician is one who can explain to people why things are happening in their lives. So I think there needs to be kind of grassroots action that needs to happen at lower levels. But I think it also needs to happen at those kind of mid and high levels where addressing kind of the relevancy of policy and making things feel felt by people, right? I think this is one of Donald Trump's political talents in a way, is speaking to his base and making them feel that the things that he says relate to them. Of course, Donald Trump is a son of a billionaire who inherited like $1.6 billion from his father. Not really representative of like his average constituent. But I think that's the power of politics, is explaining and making those things relevant to your constituents. So if the Democratic Party wants to do that, they also have to be able to kind of embrace a narrative that connects them to their constituency that way.
Yeah, I'll just add that it is typical after an election that the party that is out of power is going to spend some time looking inward and trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next? And when President Trump lost the election in 2020, he did that in a very loud way, right? But it's quite typical, quite natural for there to be some soul searching for, okay, we need to reconfigure, find some new strategies, find some new tactics. But as Nick said, the midterms are only a year and a half away, and I'm sure that we will have some big national issues that you can sink your teeth into by that time.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. Once again, I'm really appreciative that there's young people here like asking questions too, because I've seen, it seems like the older generation is scared. They've seen it before, and young people have just never lived through it, so they're like, oh, I don't care. Yeah, but no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Does this work? I can be loud. So I had a question. So I'm currently in microeconomics, and we just covered kind of like monopolistic, like perfect competition. I'm kind of curious as to how, the tariff would offset the costs that would be paid by the consumers and stuff. How would that really factor in towards like who would survive that like the best, or I guess like in terms of like price making after like the tariffs, or after kind of like years down the road, whether or not there'd be an emergence of greater price making by firms of greater bargaining power, and would that translate into lobbying as well? Because I know you mentioned the issue in the subsidies possibly to kind of offset the pain, but what would that really look like realistically? Would it be proportional, or?
I have no idea what that would look like realistically. We'll have to wait and see. Insofar as the tariffs are not especially proportionate, I'm not optimistic that there will be a lot of rational thinking behind that either. To answer your first question, or to respond to your first comment, yes, one of the effects of tariffs is to reduce competition, and that's among the reasons why economists are not real big fans of tariffs relative to other kinds of public policies. It does tend to protect, hence the name protectionism, right? Otherwise, less efficient, low productivity firms, and provides them with a kind of a captured market, and with all of the price implications that would have. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
As of 2024, the Commerce Department said that there was only 4% of all U.S. companies that engaged in exportation. With these new tariffs coming in, and Trump administration saying the goal of these tariffs is not to just increase domestic production here, but also to compete on the global market, how feasible are these comments with our exportation only being 4% of all U.S. companies, and how we're lacking severely in exports currently?
So far, the justifications for the tariffs that have been proposed by the president have not really addressed exporting, except for the hope or the aim of reducing barriers in other countries to, say, U.S. firms and exports. It is true, however, that insofar as the tariff policy raises the cost of productions for U.S. firms, they will have a harder time to compete on the global market. Now, that won't matter for selling in the U.S. market, but it will make them maybe less competitive or less successful in competing abroad. And a number of firms, a number of manufacturers who source raw materials or intermediate goods from other places to finish in the U.S. than for exporting have really pointed this out, that if their raw materials or their imported goods are tariffed at a high rate, that will not only raise their costs and their prices in the U.S., but will threaten their competitiveness in the global marketplace.
Thank you.
My understanding, and not an economist, but my understanding is that while the composition of U.S. exports has changed significantly, if you look at the longer term trend, the amount of exports from the U.S., exports as a percentage of GDP, had been generally steadily increasing, right? It's just that imports had increased at a much faster rate, hence why we went from fairly balanced trade in the 1970s to a large trade deficit today. But interestingly, the last time I looked at that data, it had been relatively flat in terms of, you have this line, exports going up, steadily up, not dramatically, but it's been flat since a period of time that largely corresponds with when we started experimenting with tariffs, since we started imposing tariffs in the first Trump administration, which suggests at least that the effect of tariffs so far has not been to significantly boost U.S. exports. In fact, it seems to have been the opposite.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
So, interestingly, the colleagues almost got there, but haven't quite got there on the question that the young lady posed when she used the word tax, and nobody's up here in the panel has used the word tax. Isn't this essentially a tax for all of us? I cannot buy what I used to buy at a cheaper price, so now that's no longer available because of the tariff, and so now I'm going to have to pay more. And so two questions. One, who initially pays the tax? It seems the tariff. It seems that there's a political narrative around that they are paying this tariff. We are not paying the tariff. They are stealing from us. We're going to get that money back. And so number one, is that an accurate narrative or a false narrative? And then so initially who pays? And then of course, ultimately, who pays? Is it the consumer who really pays ultimately? You have put up a chart where people largely agree on the inflationary effects of tariffs. In other words, things are going to get more expensive. Where's the narrative around that?
If we weren't clear before, we definitely need to be clear now that a tariff is a tax. It is assessed by the importing country on its own people and its own businesses. Now, they're writing the checks, right? It'll be U.S. businesses writing the check to the federal government. Now, there are two related questions to that then, as to how to share that burden or spread that burden around to the extent possible. And this will vary by industry and vary by the structure of each different market. On the one hand, some importers, when faced with a tariff, will try to negotiate with the exporters to get them to lower their price and thereby absorb some of that tariff. You may have read recently that this is something Walmart has been trying to do with its Chinese suppliers. Now, Walmart's in a pretty unique position in terms of bargaining power. Most smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses in the U.S. will not be able to accomplish that kind of cost sharing or burden sharing. And incidentally, the best estimates I've seen on the tariffs during the first Trump administration were that something like 90 to 95% of those tariffs were absorbed by U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers. The second question then is the importing company, right? As those goods go through the internal or domestic supply chain, the wholesaler, the distributor, the retailer, each one of those is going to have to decide, well, how much of this additional cost, this tax, can I pass along to my clients and customers versus how much am I going to have to eat? Because I don't want to lose so many of my clients and customers. That breakdown, that will vary quite a lot by the nature of the market and the nature of the product involved. Some of those will end up affecting the end user consumer by a lot. Others will be absorbed along the way.
Okay, I think we will have to make this our last question. Incidentally, once we are done with our conversation, we do have some food, refreshments, appetizers through the door over here that were generously provided by our friends at the Coggin College of Business. So do please feel free to help yourself to some food. You're welcome to hang out on the deck out here and enjoy the beautiful view of our lovely campus, or to stay in here and to continue this discussion with one another. But we will have our final question. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. So, assuming that the Liberation Day tariffs, go into effect, and at their varying rates for different countries, do you think in the short to medium term, the rates of transshipping would explode? Transshipping being instead of importing directly, say from China to the U.S. at say a 35% tariff, you import from China to say the Philippines and then to the U.S. to get a lower rate. Do you think that will become more popular as opposed to trying to move the production directly into the United States?
That's entirely possible. I think what you're pointing out is one example of the kind of adjustment that will have to take place. And that's a pretty costly adjustment. If you remember during COVID and the buildup of the empty containers, right, trying to get in and out of ports because of the shock to those supply chains, I think we could see some similar kinds of episodes going forward.
All right. Right.
Partially. So most of the tariff policy is, or duties of this type have what are called rules of origin, and it will be based on the fraction of the value added at each point along the supply chain. And so how much of that was due to the Chinese part, how much of it was due to the Philippines part, or how much is due to the Mexico part before it enters into the U.S.
Just when I thought this couldn't get any more complicated. Okay, well, we will finish there. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Kyle and Russell, for joining me this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. This concludes the spring season of the Diverse Perspectives series, but we will be holding additional events coming up in the fall, most likely on housing and healthcare policy. These were what students voted for in our poll that we put out earlier this semester. So thank you all again, and do please help yourself to the food and refreshments in the adjoining room here. Thank you.